and you are now listening to Women's Inspiration. I am Dr. Joan Rosenberg, and I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm a professional speaker, and I have a private psychotherapy practice in West Los Angeles, and I teach in a graduate program in psychology. I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Dr. Erica Yemtobian, who also teaches in a graduate program in psychology, and I'm currently serving as a registered psychologist at a community mental health agency. This is a program by, for, and about women and the people who care about them. Our mission is to educate women to help promote a culture of positivity, health, and transformation.
And tonight we are joined by Jerome Front. Jerome is a marriage, family, and child therapist in private practice in Studio City. He teaches weekly mindfulness meditation classes and has maintained his own mindfulness meditation practice for 19 years. Since 1999, he has been a year-round adjunct faculty member in the Graduate School of Clinical Psychology at Pepperdine University, where he trains students to be therapists. He leads local retreats 2 times each year where people come together to learn relaxation and meditation, and he teaches weekly meditation classes in Studio City that help people bring practical mindfulness into their everyday life. He has attended multiple trainings, workshops, and retreats with some of the best meditation teachers in the world, and he is here tonight to talk with us about using mindfulness in your everyday life. Jerome, we want to thank you so much for making the time to talk with us in the KCSN studio.
Well, thank you for having me in. I appreciate it. It's fun to be here.
Jerome, can you tell us what is mindfulness?
Well, it's a fairly common question in terms of what mindfulness is. And I think that mindfulness really, in my practice and in the way that I want people to understand it, is really related to a way of being. It's sort of a way of being in your heart and being present, maybe knowing what you're doing while you're doing it, paying full attention, and have some sort of heartful attention to what you're doing. Now, but it's easy to confuse the state of mindfulness with the kind of things that bring it about. For example, if you want to become more mindful, one way is to practice mindfulness meditation. So meditation, you could say, maybe is the route or the tool that people use in order to cultivate more mindful ways of being.
You mentioned this notion of being present, and perhaps being present is being mindful. Can you talk more about what being present really means?
Well, I think that is a great question. It's one of the hardest questions that we discuss with clients in our weekly meditation class, or even with the therapists that I train, because it's easier to know when someone isn't present than to explain what presence is. Do you know, have you ever got a massage from someone who doesn't really want to be doing it while they're doing it? You can just tell they're not really present while they're touching you, or when someone's just half paying attention to you. And so you definitely have a quick idea when somebody's not present. But I think that what we're trying to do in cultivating presence is having a sense of the person being fully there in their mind and their body and their spirit, so that there's a kind of resonance that you feel. You can almost feel when someone's listening to you, when they're fully attending to you. And there are ways to sort of cultivate that. But it does come from a moment-to-moment way of paying attention.
And what are the benefits of being more mindful or practicing mindfulness?
Well, the benefits are quite huge. Originally, one of my main teachers is Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. And in 1997, I started the first group training that he provided for helping professionals, and I've been to several of them since then. And early in the days when people were practicing mindfulness for stress reduction, it seemed like that the original benefits were just a reduction in stress, maybe less anxiety during the day, more of an ability to cope, which in and of itself would be huge. But what happened along the way, and these were just casual reports, some of the people at the UMass, University of Massachusetts Medical Center, where that stress reduction clinic was located, they just began to report that they became less depressed and less anxious, and more healing was happening during some of their physical therapies. And so some of the researchers began to take this seriously and look into it. And over the years, we've begun to find that as people become more mindful, it has a significant effect on people's brains and their immune functioning that provides like real real health benefits to people, plus a greater capacity to enjoy life. And not to mention there's all kinds of benefits now related to doing it with children and using it for relationships so that people could learn to be more present with each other, more ability to cope. So the benefits are quite large now, and they're just growing. There's like an explosion of interest and information on it.
Well, if we went the route of relationships, which you just mentioned, what if I'm more mindful in a relationship? What differences might I see?
Well, starting with some of the basic information about it, is that one of the things I like to say, like now, or maybe even about the relationships, is I want to sort of remove for people the idea that mindfulness is something weird or new age about it, some of the myth about it, so that when we're practicing it, if we could ground it or base it a little bit in some of the recent research, then people might be more willing to use it for relationships or in their own life. So one of the things that's research-based, and this is Dan Siegel's work, who's a brain researcher and psychiatrist at UCLA. In his book, The Mindful Brain, Dr. Siegel talks about how that when you activate the mindfulness circuits of your brain by just practicing mindfulness, they overlap with the social circuits of the brain, the ones that form deep attachment and bonding within people. So even if you were meditating in isolation, it would begin to kindle the capacity in you to develop relational qualities like presence and compassion, even with the different people you're in relationship with. But beyond that, I use it with couples, and there's some significant ways you can use mindfulness in relationships, because generally one way is you see relationships break down around the fact when people stop feeling understood by the other person. At that point, you have communication stop and sex stop, and sometimes people want to come in and say, we need to get our sexual relationship back on track, something like that. But I find that they've stopped being friends. They're no longer really intimate in the emotional sense. So doing some kind of behavioral or sexual part of the relationship doesn't always get it back on track because people aren't feeling understood, and they're feeling very emotionally reactive to each other. And through the practice of mindfulness, there are very specific ways they can learn to not be so reactive to each other and restore their ability to deeply listen so that it feels very soothing to be with your partner. And you kind of look forward to more of that with them. So,
can you talk about, before we started this interview, I was talking to you, Jerome, about how much of an impact you had on me when I was a student of yours earlier, and you were the first one to expose me to mindfulness meditation practices. Can you talk about, when you teach your students, when you teach clients about mindfulness, can you talk about what you're actually teaching them?
Yeah, and I think that part of my bias about that is that I follow the UMass philosophy where I've had most of my training only because I believe it to be true. And that's that I think that the parents who teach it to children, the therapists who teach it to their clients, do best and they're more competent if they have their own practice. And it is the philosophy that competency is gained by having your own meditation practice. So part of the thing that I like to do when I teach it is to make it as practical and common sensible as possible. That one doesn't need to be Buddhist to do it, and one doesn't need to be still. And so when I teach it to students as it's evolved over time, whether they're graduate students or just, regular people who come to the weekly meditation classes, I like to begin to work with the myths that they have at helping them not drop away from the practice by addressing the common myths or fears that they have right away about the meditation practice.
And some of those myths might be what?
One of them would be, is it equal to relaxation? As John Kabat-Zinn likes to say, meditation is not relaxation spelled differently. If you want to do relaxation, you might want to do some stretching and releasing or deep breathing. But when you're doing mindfulness meditation, sometimes it involves a lot of concentration. You feel like it's a little bit of a mental workout. And at the end of it, you're making yourself more hardy to stress by what happens. But it's not necessarily equating with relaxing when it happens. Another myth would be, is that somehow people like to say, I can't practice mindfulness because I would go crazy if I had to sit still. I'm like one of these people, I would just jump out of the window, since I have to be quiet for a half hour. My mind won't stop thinking. My mind won't stop racing. My butt hurts. I'm going crazy. I'm so bored. I can't stay awake and all of that kind of stuff. Well, what we're finding out is those things are not preventions to learning meditation. Those are actually the necessary prerequisites for learning meditation. And that's partially because those things activate the stress centers of your brain. They activate a stressful response in you caused by the meditation. And so you're taught to work in real time with these real stressors that come up because of the meditation. So you learn to be hardy with real-time stressors that are caused by the meditation. So it causes you to develop new areas of your brain and new coping capacities by just dealing with your own boredom and your own frustration and your own physical pain and restlessness during the meditation. So if you find yourself being bored or sleepy, then you're very welcome in the class. That's part of our condition that we all deal with. So.
You are listening to Women's Inspiration on 88.5 FM with your hosts, Dr. Erica Yemtobian and Dr. Joan Rosenberg. And tonight we're speaking with Jerome Front about the benefits of mindfulness. What about, I'm thinking of another myth that a lot of people probably have about mindfulness, is that there's so much going on. We are overstimulated with our cell phones, our computers. I mean, it's nonstop. What about if somebody says, I can't practice mindfulness because I'm too busy. There's too much going on in my life.
Well, I think that, that's a very common thing that has to happen. And the term is we have to carve out some time for it. Because in large measure, I think our society is partially responsible for this, not just any individual person or their family. It comes down to the fact that we no longer appreciate what I call the being values or the contemplative values. Those being values might be something like being genuine, being authentic, being still, being silent, being grateful, being reverent. And we're not taught those anywhere, being reflective. What we are taught is the doing values. We have to get A's. We have to get the biggest SUV. We have to live in the nicest neighborhood. We get paid for being efficient. We get paid for being productive. And so it generally puts us into what there's a consciousness researcher, Roger Walsh at UC Irvine, who refers to this kind of living as the trance of the trivial, where we sort of run around from place to place, staying busy, doing things all the time. And we all kind of accept this as the basic way of living. Mm-hmm. What's most surprising to me about that is the comment that I get when people say, it's wonderful when you go up to the Esalen Institute in Big Sur and you're all relaxing for the weekend, or when you're in local and Malibu retreats, you're all relaxing. But what good is it for you to go there and escape reality, and then you got to come back home and deal with reality? And so the way that I like to look at that is, so you're telling me that when we go off someplace peaceful, albeit they give us our meals and our bedding, but when you go off to a retreat center and you finally have time to relax your body, to see what's in your heart, when you finally have time to be self-reflective, to see where you stand, to practice some relaxation and coping, you spend time listening to other people and listening to your own mind and heart. I doubt in my mind whether that's an escape from reality. And then when you come back home after the retreat, you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, trying to be busy and do all these things as if that were reality that you're coming back to. So I try to have people question that overall in terms of what reality really is and how we get locked into a certain way of being.
Mm-hmm. In light of what you were talking about, the level of activity, Erica, and your response just a moment ago, Jerome, is it possible also to be mindful while engaged in activity?
Yeah, in fact, I think that that's partially the answer. There's two ways to look at it. If you came with me or some other mindfulness teacher, we would teach you two things if it was a thorough class, or if you come across several retreats across several years. One of them would be what I call formal practice. That's where you sit down and decide for 20 or 30 minutes, 45 minutes to follow your breathing or to do the body scan or some formal meditation that you're taught, and you put this time aside to do it every day. Mm-hmm. The second kind of practice, which is equally important, and it's always been part of contemplative traditions, is called the householder's practice. This is where, when you're folding the laundry or you're doing the dishes or listening to the children, or like I know I have a 5 and 6-year-old. One of them is like pulling on me. They need to go to the bathroom. They need me to wipe, and my wife needs me to do the dishes, and the other one needs the lunch. And I'm thinking I have 1 minute to do email before I walk out. And you're realizing that if I can just get past my impatience and frustration, that there's some moment of practice within there where I try to take a look that there can only be one thing that I can do at one time. And so somehow I bring attention to my own frustration, to my own impatience, trying to be a little more reflective that it's getting played out, and then be a little more intentional and decisive about who do I attend to, and what are they feeling right now, and should I listen to this child or that child, being a little bit deliberate about what you're doing. Or in bringing your senses to the work, it helps a lot. Like if you're folding laundry or doing something.
So again, part of what you're describing is this notion of being much more aware of each moment, as much as we can, to each moment as it comes.
Much more aware of each moment as it comes.
And kind of without judgment.
Without judgment, and kind of finding a way to accept it because it's already this way. And, one of the old traditions, it's a very common story in the yoga and meditation traditions, is this old idea, we have sort of medieval visions of when people sharpen their sword. Mm-hmm. There's a fast spinning wheel, and it's called the grindstone. And then you hold your sword against the grindstone, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea is to sharpen the grindstone. But if you think about it, what is the difference when you hold your sword to the grindstone? What's the difference between whether you grind that sword flat or whether you sharpen it? What's the difference on that?
Is this a trick question?
No. Well, I don't have a trick answer for it.
Good.
But I think that the answer would be the only difference is in how you hold it, how you position it. You can hold that sword a certain angle, and it will grind the sword down, and you will lose its edge. Or if you have skill at holding it, you will sharpen it and bring out the best in it. That's the same when you have grinding people in your life. People who wear you down, relationships that grind you down, or just daily obligations with the kids or with work obligations that grind you down. It's the same obligation, but you can choose to cultivate a heartful awareness and be aware of not wanting it and resenting it. And then on top of that, sort of bring your whole heart to participating in the activity because it's already there, doing it in a way where it just sharpens you. It's like just because you don't want to do it doesn't make it go away. That's what we say during the sitting meditation in class. Mm-hmm. You might wish that it were over, especially if we're in the second minute of 30 minutes of sitting. You might wish that it were over, but that won't make it so. You'll just have 28 minutes of misery sitting there wishing it were over. So if you can turn how you hold it and see it as an opportunity to work with what your mind does, you can just sometimes rotate your mind and change the way you see circumstances. So it's a deep change on the inside that any of us can do.
It's a wonderful way to think of it.
You talked about your family, and I'm wondering if you can talk about how you came to work with mindfulness personally and professionally.
Well, on my website, jeromefront.com, on the home page, if you scroll down, there's a couple of newsletters posted there you can read. One of them is about a little story that I wrote a couple years ago called, it's a true story, called Sitting in the Dark Church Late at Night. And I grew up in a very contemplative tradition where we had to go to church every day, 7 days a week. And I guess I was in one of those people, maybe in a minority, who didn't find it a bad experience. There was a lot of praying and contemplation all day. It was such a poor school. There's only 13 in my graduating class. There's no money for lunch service. So when it was lunch service, the mothers would cook. And we would stay after school with the parents, and we would clean the floors ourselves. Nobody was bent out of shape about it. So we learned to care for our environment and to bring prayer into it, and that even in mopping the floor or sitting in the church in the dark, it was all part of being alive. You just brought your full heart to all the little activities. And in sitting in the dark church at night, we'd have these services where my dad would come home sometimes, and the instruction during these devotional periods would be, don't do word prayers. Just go into the church and sit in silence and just see what you notice while you're sitting in silence. And so when I was a little boy, my dad would come home sometimes after the 3 to 11 shift at the steel mill, and he would say, when I was 9 or 10, do you want to walk over with me? So I'd say, yeah. And so we would just go and sit in the dark church. And it was the first time I think, and during those years of my life, where I learned the value of silence, and that some of the best things in life, their value can't be measured by a clock or by efficiency, but just a way of being in silence. And so as I grew through my life, I began to find a connection between certain mindful activities in this way of working with silence and presence and paying attention that you can just bring into everyday life. It doesn't need to be anything weird or exotic or anything like that.
What a beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
You are listening to Women's Inspiration on 88.5 FM with your hosts, Dr. Joan Rosenberg and Dr. Erica Yemtobian. And tonight we are speaking with Jerome Front about the benefits of mindfulness. You're talking about such a wonderful experience as in terms of your own growing up, and wondered if you could talk then about the benefits of mindfulness for children.
Well, I think that that's kind of a new frontier, and I think the benefits are clear, and I think that one of the things we're trying to decide, say in the therapy or the psychology or the child development business, is what might be the best way to teach it to children and what might be a good way of doing it. I do know certain schools that have done the formal mindfulness-based stress reduction program with children. But there are different ways where, I think I'd mentioned this earlier, where Dan Siegel was the brain researcher who's a developmental specialist at UCLA, was talking about the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But in all his brain research with developing minds, it's his belief that, based on brain research, that children should be taught a 4th R, which would be reflection, teaching them how not to be immediately reactive, how to have heartfelt self-awareness, an ability to feel the resonance in their bodies of how they feel about things, and to be able to reflect on it and maybe make a decision to think about maybe what choice of action they want to take. And so many times I think that this is a very important thing to teach children. And sometimes it comes down to, I think, beginning them to be skillful with silence. One of my clients is an LAUSD school teacher who's a teaching specialist in the district. And she was talking about how there's such a move towards helping teachers be reflective and wanting students to be reflective. And our discussion briefly centered around that I'm not sure that could be taught without teaching people how to be comfortable in silence. And, you get into a lot of strange things where people worry in certain school districts that they don't want prayer to be taught. They equate silence with prayer. And we're just kind of looking at silence as a tool that allows children time to cool down and look into themselves as a source of knowledge and to begin to know their own minds and their own hearts. And so I think periods of silence are useful, and then having children watch what goes through their mind or having them do sensory activities. So they're developing this moment-to-moment attention. But that's open to us to learn anytime throughout our lifespan.
What about any differences between meditation practices for men as opposed to women? Do you see any?
Well, I think that as far as I could tell, it seems to me like women seem to be more open to the practice sometimes overall. I think maybe that might even be a reflection of therapy in general. They seem to be more comfortable and in touch with their feelings and willing to look inwards, maybe willing to talk about relationships. But I think that on the retreats, I see somewhat of an equal interest in it where people are coming to it. But I think that if you're anybody who's a parent, like if you're a mother, you're a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad, I think we were talking about earlier, the opportunities are really great to bring it into your primary activity, whether you're a mother or housekeeper or whether you're a significant other in a relationship, trying to bring a little bit of mindfulness to each of the moments of those activities. Just bring it right into the household care, the care of the laundry or something like that.
And in relation to the practices maybe being possibly different for men as opposed to women, do you see any benefits that would be different in terms of men and women?
I don't know of any offhand. I think that as mindfulness becomes more research-oriented, this would be a wonderful area of research, how it could be specifically taught to certain populations, children versus teens, men versus women. And I think that this would be a wonderful way to maybe look into that further with research and begin saying, how can we customize this more to the people we're teaching it to? And that's how I've used some of the brain research when I use mindfulness to train helping professionals. It allows me to make more specific training activities based on the research so that the benefits are very specific to the population. But those are really good questions. I think they're probably, it would be worthy of research on those areas.
We typically ask a signature question. What are some key thoughts or recommendations you have to help promote a more positive culture or culture of positivity?
Well, I think that it would be, at least in terms of mindfulness, people realizing that being mindful is not a luxury, that it really is something they deserve, that we're sort of hardwired to be mindful. It's not a luxury to take time to relax and to find peace within your own life in the midst of every day. And I think that taking the steps to do that, whether you just can pay attention to a hot bath, sort of like the Calgon days, or take a nice walk, but it's important, like while you're taking a walk, to just actually feel your feet walking and just look at the clouds shifting and begin to move your attention on purpose just to watching the flow of the breeze on your skin or the clouds moving in the sky and what it feels like when you sit down or fall, smelling the fall air. It's a beautiful time to take a look at the changing colors and the smells in the air. So that I think that it's a wonderful way to just be in your senses, to be in your body, and to take time for that, because it's not a little thing. It has very significant benefits to your brain and to your health to cultivate being present for the little moments in your own life like that.
It almost sounds like, in what you're saying, it's heightening our awareness of all the activities of our mind, whether it's being aware of our senses, or aware of what we're thinking, or aware of what we're feeling.
Yeah, and it's true. And it's not so much that we just favor our body over our mind, but to become more aware of all of those different parts of ourselves. But I think in our culture, we're taught that only what passes through our mind is a source of intelligence. And we kind of underplay our body as a source of knowledge and as a source of health and a source of knowing. And so when I talk about favoring sensory meditations or relaxing in your body, it's not so much that I favor it as much as I want to counterbalance the traditional education that's top-heavy. And it allows people to have a more balanced way of looking.
Or even, I think of it as paying attention to your intuition. A lot of people dismiss that because you can't, where is the intuition, you know? We can't measure it. But I find my intuition to be right on all the time if I pay attention to it.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I think that practicing moment-to-moment awareness heightens those kinds of capacities.
Right.
There's some amazing research that Dan Siegel has talked about at UCLA, and it's kind of speculative at this point. But there are certain nerve waves that have always existed, but they're kind of discovering them, that extend from the middle part of your brain that's a feeling center, and they wrap right around your heart. And there's one that wraps right around your gut. And they give you direct feedback when you're feeling something. So when you say, my heart is telling me, or in my gut I know, that it's not just your gut speaking to you, that it's actually your whole feelings. And that when you learn to pay attention to your heart, when you learn to pay attention literally to your heartbeat during meditation, or to your sensations in your gut, you're actually informing not just your body sensations, but getting more in touch with the subtleties of feeling. There's even research that shows that when you pay more close attention to heartbeat moment to moment, that it causes a capacity in people to be more compassionate. It's such a beautiful metaphor that as you get more in touch with your heart, finding your heart is what I call it in the meditation. Can you locate where your heart is right now? Literally in the heartbeat, in the breathing. That it kindles pathways in you towards being more heartful in your life and in your relationships.
Wow. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, and I feel like we're just getting started. We want to thank Jerome Front for joining us tonight. And if you would like to contact him, you can email him at frontmail@earthlink.net, or go to his website, which is www.jeromefront.com, or you can call him at 818-760-7725.
This is Dr. Joan Rosenberg and Dr. Erica Yamtobian, and if you want to reach us regarding our show, you can contact us at women'sinspiration@kcsn.org. Please remember to join us next week for another stimulating program on women's inspiration.
Named the Best of LA by Los Angeles Magazine, this is 88.5 FM, KCSN and KCSN HD, Northridge, Los Angeles, a broadcast service of California State University Northridge since 1963, and streaming on the web at kcsn.org. Arts and Roots Radio for Southern California and the world.